We are in a series that's focusing on a question that John, Andrew, Peter, and James asked Jesus in private up on the Mount of Olives. It's a question that I think we've all pondered at once in our life. They asked Jesus, hey, when are you going to come back? They want to know what to look for. Give us a sign that we will know that your return is imminent. So we've been unpacking the conversation that they had and the signs that Jesus gave. The core verse, or you can say our base of operation for this particular teaching series, is found in Matthew chapter 24. And we're looking at verses 3 through 10. So if you have your Bibles, or if you use an electronic device, you can turn there now, or you can simply follow along on the PowerPoint. In just a few minutes, this particular conversation between these four disciples and Jesus is also recorded in Luke chapter 21 and over in Mark chapter 13. And we're going to look at one verse from Luke chapter 21 today, because I've been promising you about monsters in the Bible, right? And I wanted you guys to know that I wasn't lying. Monsters is mentioned in the Bible as we break down the Greek, and we'll look at what that means in just a few minutes. So as we started this particular teaching series, we really focused on that word sign, because Jesus was sitting there talking to his disciples. They didn't ask, hey man, can you just tell us when you're coming? Remember that Greek word, pote. They wanted a precise sign. They wanted to know there was no ambiguity in the answer that they were seeking. So Jesus, being Jesus, gives them more than they asked for, and that's something that's a takeaway for all of us. Jesus always gives us more than we need. Always. But anyway, that's a sermon for a different day. Jesus cannot give them a precise sign with just one that they asked. So he goes on and gives a list of them here that you will know where you are on God's prophetic timetable leading up to the rapture if you look for these signs. So let's read Matthew 24, starting in verse 4. And Jesus answered and said to them, take heed no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For a nation will, or some translations say shall, rise against nation. In the original text, it goes on to say, kingdom shall rise against kingdom. And there shall be famines, and there shall be earthquakes in various places. So far, we've covered deception in verse 4. We used 2 Timothy chapter 3 to unmask what the spirit of deception will look like in the last of the last days. We didn't spend a lot of time on false teachers because it's self-explanatory, and we saw the evidence of what false teaching brings as we studied the spirit of deception. We got to verse 6 and looked at wars. Remember, that comes from the Greek word polymos. And polymos means it's going to be multiple. They're going to be taking place simultaneously all around the world. And when we see this word war, don't think of kinetic fighting between one country's army and another country's army. Yes, that's what that means, kinetic warfare against two large armies, but it also means armed skirmishes. It means armed conflict. It means riots, small and large scale, taking place, kind of like in France right now, if you read the news, taking place around the world simultaneously. Then we come to rumors. Remember, that's the Greek word akoio. Means something in the ear. It means something in the ear over and over and over and over again. It's negative information in the ear coming at you over and over again. And in the first century, this word means the information in the ear. And when you look at akoi, means that it puts a person, an individual person, or a city, or a nation on pins and needles because of worry, because of anxiety, because of all the things, negative stimuli that they're taking into their ear. Then we get down to the next verse was nation versus nation. Last week we talked about, I think it was last week, the word nation here is ethnos. And ethnos means in the first century that just what you think it is. There's going to be ethnic fighting. There's going to be an attitude of I'm better than you based on what part of the country I come from or what part of the world I come from. And this becomes a huge issue in the last of the last days. Then you get the nation versus nation, and that comes from the Greek word balasia, which means ideology. Ideologies are going to clash in the last of the last days. In the religious realm, in the political realm, in the philosophical realm, in the educational realm. And when they clash, it's not just a clash. It's like when you read this in the original and put it up against the first century, Jesus is saying these ideologies are going to clash into each other and try to decimate one another. And there is no compromise. There is no middle ground. It's going to get ugly. Then that word shall, that mellow, the Greek word mellow, Jesus threw that in there on all of these in this portion of Matthew to tell the disciples this isn't something that's going to happen right now. Because everything that Jesus mentioned here was taking place in and around Jerusalem in the Roman Empire in the first century. He's saying this is something that's going to take place on out in the future. You know, he doesn't say how far out in the future, but the disciples knew it wasn't something that was going to happen in the next 2 or 3 months. And that leads us to where we are now. I covered a lot just then, didn't I? Were you glad? Because I don't want to take too long, because I got a bunch of stuff to cover. So let me take a deep breath. All right. So today we're going to cover famines, earthquakes, pestilence, terrors, and great signs from the sky. Okay? So we're going to do this rapid fire again. So, and I'm not being facetious. If you have a question, if I'm going too fast or I confuse you, raise your hand so I can clarify. I don't want you walking out of here confused like those guys sitting next to you, Roger. But they came in the door confused, so I mean, there's not much I can do. Out in the future. Okay, the question that she asked is, since the word mellow is out in the future, how will we know where we are on God's prophetic timeline? This is the issue with what we're looking at. Part of what we're looking at, you start to see it take place, but it's not going to come to fruition. I was going to talk about it later on. It will not reach its zenith until after the church is raptured. So Christ talks about birth pangs. And I've never had a baby. I can't biologically have one, no matter what people say. But I have heard tell it hurts, okay? I have heard, in fact, when Sherry was hooked up to this machine back in the day, when Jordan was in the process of entering this world, I would look at it and I'd say, oh, that's going to be a bad one. Because you could tell the way it was fluctuating. And she finally said, kind of like if you watched Amityville Horror or something, she kind of goes, shut your mouth. I'm like, you don't got to tell me twice. I don't know what just happened, but baby, I'm sorry. And so I just kept my mouth shut. Anyway, so you can know that we're in the last of the last days, okay? The stitch of time that we're in would be classified what Jesus was talking about in the last days. But how long will last days go? I don't know. But you can say you're going to see these things that we're talking about. You've already seen them. Everything that we've talked about, you've seen on the news. As it intensifies and becomes more frequent, you know that you're moving along that prophetic timeline. Because Jesus says we'll never know the day or the hour, but he didn't say we wouldn't know the week. All right, so it's safe to say we all know about famines. That's the next one up. The seventh sign is famines. If you grew up in the 80s, which I'm sorry you didn't because it was the best decade, but you like the 70s, that's cool. All right, 50s, 60s, whatever. It's perspective, man. That's open, that's subjective. I shouldn't go there. Yes, it is. All right, so remember the photographs that you would see in Ethiopia when that famine came in and it just ravaged that whole country? Yes, and so the famine that he's talking about here does mean those images that come to mind of mass starvation, poverty, malnutrition, third world setting. But this means more. So when we look at famine here, it comes from the Greek word limos. And limos is a plural word. So when you look at this in the context in which Jesus is talking about this, because famines were very familiar in through the Roman Empire at the time of Christ. He's talking about a famine that's not just going to be in one geographical area of the world. There's going to be food shortages all around the world. See, this word limos means, when you study it in the Greek and you look at it, it means famine like you think, but it also means, especially in the first century, a grain deficit. So a grain deficit in the first century meant things are going to get rough. See, Egypt in the first century was the breadbasket for the entire Roman Empire. It's been said that America is the breadbasket of the world. Until they do away with tractors and go back to plowing fields with a mule, then would it barely be a breadbasket for us. But in the first century, the Roman Empire depended on Egypt and the area of Egypt and North Africa to produce enough grain to be shipped out through the empire so there would be no hunger. Tons left those ports on a daily basis. Mark Antony, that's one of his jobs, but he got sidetracked by a lady, so had to replace him. But anyway, what happens when there's a food or a grain deficit in the first century? It started to trickle down through the whole economic sphere, and everything started to have a deficit. So when Jesus is talking here to the disciples and he uses the word melo, saying this is going to happen out in the future, he's talking about deficits that our country needs to survive, to work. It's kind of like this. In the last of the last days, if you look at this and you put the word limos under the microscope to try to determine what Jesus is saying, for us today, he's saying that there's going to be mass deficits in the last of the last days. Deficits financially, financial shortfalls, with your electrical power grid, things that are necessary for survival or that we have become accustomed to. There will be food deficits. There will be fuel deficits. There will be medical deficits, as in doctors and medicine. That's what he's talking about when he uses this word famine. And along with what I just told you on the deficits, there is a definite food problem that will take place all around the world. Now, I believe that we have seen some of this shortages. Think back to 2000. We had a toilet paper shortage. Remember? You go to the Bi-Lo or somewhere. Bi-Lo, they don't have those anymore. Go to Walmart, and was the toilet paper aisle full or empty? It's because he had it all down in Simpsonville. But anyway, that's the kind of deficits that you're going to need to get used to as we enter the last of the last days. I read an article a while back. Baby formula was short, remember? There was all sorts of shortages. There's medicine, there's chemotherapy. This hits kind of close to home. I read an article that there's certain chemotherapies that are in short supply right now. And people cannot get the necessary medicine they need in the United States of America. That's the deficits Jesus is talking about. So, of these deficits that I just mentioned, what's within our control? Hunger. You know, I was thinking about what kind of takeaway do I attach to this for you and I to think about how we can shine our light, how can we be ecclesia in the last of the last days. 8 billion people, over 8 billion people in the world. According to the United Nations, 1 out of 9 suffer from chronic malnutrition. And when I say chronic malnutrition or chronic hunger, I'm not talking you missed a couple meals. They're saying people are days away from dying because of lack of food. 1 out of 9. Now, if you just talk about people who are missing meals here and there through the week because of whatever reason, that number gets up to about 5 to 6 worldwide out of 10. Jesus is forecasting that this is only going to get worse as he says, there shall be famines. There shall be, going to get worse. See, the thing with when you look at famines, no matter what stitch of time they're taking place in, famines produce poverty, they produce malnutrition, it ruins the economy, and then the cycle just continues to get worse and worse and worse. In fact, you could even say that famines and the poverty that's associated with it is something that Satan loves because it fits his mission statement of kill, steal, and destroy. What can we do? How many people here eat lunch during the week? All right. How many people go to and order a number 3 combo from Chick-fil-A? Okay, maybe you never. All you guys just take a bag lunch? I mean, does the lunch just fall out of the sky for you from what? You make it. That's fine. All right. So listen, lunch. The average American spends $10 a day on lunch. So let me ask you this. What if we said, I'm going to skip one lunch a week. I'm going to bring that $10 in. Or one lunch a month. And I'm going to bring that $10 in. And then in a quarter, every quarter, we send it off to a reputable organization who spends the majority of their money on food. Yeah, I say so. Because that's how we can make a difference. See, when Sherry and I stepped off the airplane in Guinea, when we became missionaries full-time with the International Mission Board, I've never been to the Republic of Guinea in Africa. I believe we were awestruck, wouldn't be the word. We were horrified as we got off the airplane at the poverty that we witnessed. Do you remember? Trash heaps, no food. We had to pray and ask the Lord, what are we going to do, Lord? The need is so big, and we're just 2 people. And the Lord gave us discernment on how to make a difference within the sphere of our influence, and that's what I'm asking us to do here. I want you to pray about it and think about it. It's something that I think we're going to start doing. We can give our money once a quarter locally to up here at the food bank up on 25 that feeds the northern part of Greenville County. You got Triune Mercy Center. You got United Ministries locally that do a great job at feeding people. And then we have overseas missionaries that we can send that money to specifically buy rice and food, and 100% of that money will go to feed people. And you know what? We can make a difference. All right. Proverbs 9:17 says, whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay them. And the other verse that goes with this, whoever closes his ear to the cry of the poor will himself call out and not be answered. The 8th sign up for consideration, earthquakes. Comes from the Greek word seismos. Now, I know we have California folk in here. How many of you experienced an earthquake? Okay, earthquakes. All right, so you guys know. We don't. Okay, tell me. Let me. You don't lie in church, Roger. Here. You sure it wasn't you ate a burrito? Really? Okay, well, see, that's weird places for them. We'll get to that. All right. So, seismos, the Greek word for earthquake, is exactly what you think. I've never been in an earthquake. I mean, does it go like this? Okay. So, earthquake, in the 1st century, seismos means natural disasters from under the ground. We'd call it an earthquake. But it also means natural disasters from the sky. We call those thunderstorms. We call those hurricanes. We call those tornadoes. We call those blizzards. So actually here, this word here, seismos, is not just talking about the earth shaking, which it is, but it's talking about natural disasters in general. It's saying that as you reach the last of the last days, then the church is going to be raptured, and then you get on into the tribulation, that this is going to become more frequent, and it's going to become very intense with the destruction that the natural disasters will cause. It will be so destructive that this word seismos in the first century means that your seasons will get blurred. That you will not have a spring, a summer, a fall, and a winter anymore. And that, when you start merging the seasons together, is only going to exacerbate the famine problem. Sherry and I were watching X-Files. Who watches the X-Files from the 90s? You know, the truth is out there. All right, so we're watching Mulder and Scully investigate this weather phenomena in Kansas. And this weatherman could manipulate the weather and cause it to do crazy things. And on the 4th of July, like we're celebrating, he caused it to have a massive blizzard. They're all out there drinking lemonade and eating hot dogs, and all of a sudden they're in 5 foot of snow. All because he was mad because some girl was kissing somebody. I don't know. But I tell you this because that's the way it's going to be in the last of the last days, over into the tribulation. Remember, what we're talking about, these signs we're going over today will not reach full potential or to reach climax in the last of the last days prior to the church being raptured. But you will see the intensification, and they will be very noticeable, and you will know kind of where you are on that prophetic timetable. All right. The pestilence. This comes from the Greek word loimos. If limos is plural, then you know loimos will be plural, meaning widespread, all over the place at the same time. Now, what do you think of when you think of pestilence? Acorns. Oh, okay. Acorns, I don't know about that. Bugs, that's what you think. Nope. In the first century, pestilence is a very unique word. It is a medical word. It is a very familiar medical word within the first century Roman Empire. Who in here is in the medical profession? Nurse, okay. Physical therapist, you hurt people. So, what is the symbol for like EMS and medical? It is a staff with a stake. Do you know where that origin of that comes from? It comes from a false temple, a false god from the pantheon in the first century. The false god of Asclepius, the god of healing, was in every pantheon in the Roman Empire. Everyone knew Asclepius, whether you were a follower of God or you were a follower of the pantheon. And within this particular temple of Asclepius, there was a loimos room. And the loimos room is where you would come in and lay down, and snakes would slither around, and if one bit you or if one touched you, you were believed to be healed. I'm glad medicine's changed, because I'd just die. I'm not going to get near a snake. Now, let me tell you this, though, real quick. Our healing power is in Jesus Christ. He heals us spiritually, and He heals us physically. He heals us mentally. He heals us emotionally if we seek Him. And I'm going to get to that in just a minute. So the disciples understood totally what He was talking about when He said, loimos. Pestilence. It means this in the first century. There will be diseases that have never been heard of will come on the scene with great frequency as you move closer and closer to the rapture of the church and on past the rapture of the church. You're going to see new diseases on the rise. But the unique word here, loimos, when it says pestilence, it's talking about old diseases that have went away are going to come back and be worse than ever. Now, you kind of get a glimpse of what that looks like with COVID, how it can shut a world down. You know, theologians have always thought that the diseases and stuff that he was talking about here with Loimos is going to come from God. But you know what? He's using man to do some of this. I don't think COVID came from a bat. You can believe that if you want. I don't want to argue with you. I'm not going to split a church over it. I'm just saying. Loimos. As we reach the end of the age, we're going to see diseases come on, and it's going to shock people to their core. So what do? How do we deal with Loimos as believers? You know, last week I shared with you some stuff from my prayer journal, and I'm going to do the same thing today. Because I want you guys to get in the habit of doing this, and I would like for you to make this your discipline as well. If you're facing a medical issue, if you're facing a mental, emotional issue, you have problems with anxiety, worry, whatever the case may be, yeah, use your doctor, but also use Scripture. This is what I pray for my family who are facing cancer. I want to share with you from Psalms 91. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. And as I pray this every morning for my oldest son and for my sister and other people who have cancer that I know, I ask the Lord, am I abiding in your shadow? Is my sister abiding in your shadow? Is JP abiding in your shadow? Because if they're not all three, if we're not in the shadow, this prayer is not really going to be effective. I will say to you, Lord, you are my refuge and my fortress in whom I trust. See, I have a tendency of misguided trust sometimes. Psalms 20 verse 7 says, some trust in horses, some trust in chariots, but I will trust in the Lord. And in the modern terms, that's, man, I'm going to trust in Dr. Friedman. I'm going to trust in Duke Medical. I'm going to trust in chemotherapies, proton therapies, new things that are coming down the line, and I forget to trust in the Lord. Verse 3, listen. For he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the deadly what? And that's where I insert brain cancer and where I insert bladder cancer for my family. Every day. That's how you pray and stand against Loimos. You want to position yourself to overcome big obstacles medically, mentally, emotionally? You have hands laid on you and you have prayer. You go to your doctor. The power of the Holy Spirit, the power of modern medicine, the power of the human spirit positions you to overcome things that if you don't use all of that in a holistic approach, you may not conquer it. Luke 21:11 talks about earthquakes, talks about famines, talks about pestilence, fearful sights. Fearful sights. This is the next one we're going to look at. This comes from the Greek word phobotron. Now, phobotron is a very unique word in the Greek language. It means terror. It means scared. It means monster. In the original Greek, in the first century, it means monstrous looks, monstrous actions, monstrous results. Now, I never thought Scooby-Doo was real, chasing monsters. He always ferreted out. It was always somebody pulling the strings. But there's monsters. Really? What does that mean in the Greek? Let's think about it. Monstrous looks. Monstrous actions. Monstrous thinking. So I was praying and said, Lord, what does this look like in the modern era? Because it's kind of hard. I can't put up Frankenstein and say, there's a monster. Fabatron in the last days will look like this. People will alter their bodies in such a way, will you bring up the first slide, that they will look like monsters. Is that a monstrous look? You know, if you're going to do that to yourself, you're missing something in your life. You're trying to fill a God-sized hole with something else, and we need to pray for people like this. I would like to see people like this come to Christ and be in our church, who have been totally changed. That is a monstrous look that you're going to see increase in the last of the last days if you really believe the word Fabatron means what it means. The next one is people will suffer from gender dysphoria, will do things to themselves that actually will end up with the monstrous look. But here's the big one. Go to the next one. I was reading an article on science and how it's starting to come in with the human body, and it says humans will eventually merge with machines. That's got to have monstrous results. AI in general, if left unchecked, will turn into a monster in the last of the last days. So when I told you that monsters within the Bible, who believed me? Who heard me talking about that? Did you believe me? Most of you thought I was pulling a leg. There it is. The last one we'll look at. Great signs from heaven. Go ahead, worship team. Why don't you guys make your way up? We'll go over this. This is not a lot to go over. This is another sign, like all the ones that we've gone over today, that will not come to total fruition until the last of the last days after the rapture. So if you have Christ in your life and you're a born-again Christian, you don't have to worry about this stuff. Great signs from heaven comes from three words, Magus Semeion Uranus. And that's saying this, that in the very last of the last days, I've got to bring this down for you. We're not going to go over as much. In the last of the last days, people are going to be looking to the skies a lot more than they used to. For different reasons. Now, I don't know about you. Is it just me? Or have we been looking up to the skies a lot lately because of spy balloons? How about blood moons? We've been looking up to the sky for these things. UFOs. Every time you turn on the news or read an article, there's unidentified flying objects out there. Space Force, which is a part of our Department of Defense. Now, not only does the United States have a Space Force, pretty much all your industrialized countries do. Now, UFOs and Space Force, we'll break that down in the fall when we get into the other side of the tribulation. And we start breaking down what the tribulation looks like. I'm not going to go in depth like they've done on Wednesday night, going verse by verse. I'm going to hit high points on it because it hits here, but we're going to take a break from it for a while. But I will tell you about UFOs and Space Force and how it ties into the end times. Private space travel makes you look up to the top. Going back to the moon, or some people think going to the moon for the first time. Trying to go to Mars. Asteroids, weather manipulation, all this stuff has us looking to the sky. And I ask myself, why, Lord? Where's he going to come back when he comes again? He's going to come in the sky. And I think that toward the end, when you start getting into the last of the last days and we start bringing our attention to the clouds for whatever reason we're looking up for, we need to think this. Think this. I want you to come back, Christ. There is a crown, one of the 5 crowns that you can receive in eternity. One of them is a person who longs for the glorious appearing of Jesus. As we look up to the sky, we should think, Christ, you're coming up there one day. I may be alive, and I may not be. You'll get my family. And we should think, thank you, Jesus, that you're bigger than the problems I'm facing down here, and it's going to be short-lived. Because I told you this is great. There's good news in these verses. It's only temporary. I'd ask you to stand. Lamos, famine, deficit. Are we really going to take and move from just thinking about people who are hungry, or try to make a difference, Paris Mountain?